Hello, everyone. Welcome to Setnor Byer Insurance and Risk's webinar on the unspeakable risk, active shooter, and other acts of violence, what every organization needs to know to prepare for and manage the aftermath. A couple things I wanted to mention before we get started here. My name is Danny Saunders. I'm a senior executive with Setnor Byer Insurance and Risk. I'm kind of pinch hitting today for Anita Setnor Byer, who unfortunately had broken kneecap this morning and is unable to attend with us, but we're thinking about her and wishing her a speedy recovery. Also wanted to mention that this webinar was planned well over 2 months ago, and purely coincidental with the horrifying events that happened in El Paso and Dayton this past weekend. That occurred. So just to know that this was in the planning stages long before that, and a topic to discuss. This particular webinar is intended to provide an overview of how to address and manage the risk of an active shooter in an employment setting or a public setting. But there's also a lot to be learned about how this would be applied to other acts of violence, which are anything that's intended to harm an individual or a group of people, whether it be with a pistol, a gun, knife, explosive device, vehicle, etc., any type of weapon. Also would want to mention that if anyone that's attending decides that they feel they do need to implement a program to prevent and prepare for an active shooter program, the Department of Homeland Security offers very comprehensive materials on the subject and guidance on building an active shooter program. While it's the program is developed with that particular risk in mind, its approach is similar to other types of catastrophic recovery plans like earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, but there are some specialized risk points for active shooter programs that can be addressed in that type of document. Triggers to the risk, such as failure of security, an unstable mind or person, and how to identify that person. Knowledge for the intended victims, were they provided the proper training, run, hide, fight, those types of items. We won't be able to address all those types of matters today but we will be providing a comprehensive review of this topic so that you're prepared to take appropriate actions and implement for your own needs. So we want to get started today with introductions for our expert panel that's here. Renee Zerkera, who is the VP of Vice President of Bryant Security. Renee is one of the few civilians in our country who's certified as a terrorism liaison officer level 1, and he's part of the Southeast Florida Fusion Center and an expert in the security field. Paul Marshall, he has 25 plus years experience in insurance and risk management and was involved in the implementation of the McGowan's active shooter and workplace violence programs. He is the managing director of active shooter and workplace violence at McGowan programs. He's been involved with over 1,000 businesses and organizations and events on this type of topic. Martin Salcedo, attorney at law, has been practicing in the state of Florida for over a decade, an expert in reviewing and interpreting statutory provisions and judicial pronouncements, legal research, and an expert in that field. Julie Tauenfeld, president of Boardroom PR, founder of Boardroom PRs in 1989, an expert in public relations, advertising, and social media. Boardroom PR, one of the largest independent PR firms in the state of Florida. So without any further ado, the items we're going to discuss today are the security protocols and best practices to protect your organization, the culpability and legal liabilities of an organization after a violent event, crisis public relations strategy tips for handling negative media attention, and gaps in insurance coverage for active shooter events and acts of violence. We're going to go over each one of these topics with our experts. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, if you can use the chat feature that you should see there on your screen and pose the questions to our experts, we will circle back to those at the end with all the questions that you might have and answer them at that point in time. So now we're going to start with Renee. So Renee, first topic is pros and cons of armed security versus unarmed security. So if you could give us a little information on that.
Well, security is a deterrence in itself, but with an armed individual, there's very little that an unarmed security officer could do if he survives the initial attack, which would just be to inform the police department. With an armed security, if it's the right armed security, they can react and eliminate the threat fairly quickly.
Right, understood. When you're doing this assessment between the types of security guards and other features, what are the differences between the security assessments that are performed by the police department versus private companies?
Well, police departments, most of them have certified officers that conduct assessments for facilities. That in itself is great, but they give you a final document. Usually with private companies, what we do, we give you an ongoing document, which is not in concrete, and it's not as discoverable as something written by a police department.
Understood. Okay. And these types of assessments, how often should they be performed?
Assessments should be performed as needed. Regularly, we'll do one assessment. We'll have a 5-year plan for changes to be implemented. Security is looked at in 3 different fields: the exterior wall per se of a facility, and then the interior. Some facilities have more security than others, but usually if there's any change in structure, an assessment should be made.
Okay, good information. Thanks for that. Homeland Security, we've already mentioned them real briefly, but they have, I'm sure, a lot of resources. They do have a lot of resources on this topic. Do they provide any funding for security for places of worship or any other types of businesses?
Places of worship do get funding. They get grants from the Department of Homeland Security. An assessment must be written by an individual company outside of the organization, and the grant should be submitted, prepared by a grant writer or an attorney. You have your better chances. Usually their funding is $75,000 to $150,000 if you're selected.
Okay. Armed security, you mentioned that's kind of an important function in certain circumstances. How do you judge how many armed security personnel you need for a particular risk?
It depends on the size of the facility. I always recommend having 1 entry point into the grounds and 1 entry point into the facility. At that point, you can have a minimum of 2. If you have multiple entry points or it's a large facility, then you would have to add additional security depending also. For example, in synagogues during high holidays, we include a lot more security. And we also involve the police department. It's very important to have your police department involved in your facility, to get to know the facility, offer them the facility to train in the facility so that the officers know how to get around the facility and not be surprised when they open a door and it's a maintenance closet.
Right. Good point. Active shooter training for your managers and staff for an employer, how important is that?
You need to give them as much knowledge as possible. You need to do that on a regular basis. I believe schools in Florida are now having 4 active shooter drills, for example, on a yearly basis, to where before they would do 1 a year prior to the Parkland massacre. And Now they do 4 times. In a place of business, I would do it yearly or anytime a new employee comes in, give them a brief. You know, the run, hide, fight method was introduced many years ago, and it seems to work. But if you're going to run, you need to know where you're running.
Right.
Therefore,
right.
you need to be familiar with your exits. You need to know what doors are always locked. You need to identify where you could cover, where you could hide. And, you know, all of this is introduced. And we talk about the physiological changes that you go through during an emergency like such, and how to control your breathing, how to control your heart rate, and most importantly, how to get it out if you can.
Right. Now it's all good points, things you don't think about until the actual something like that's happening. And hopefully no one ever has to go through that, but to have to deal with those sorts of situations at that point in time. Well, thank you for all the information, Renee. Again, if anybody has questions, they can be put in for the end of the webinar, and we'll circle back to those for Renee or our other experts. So now we're moving on to our legal counsel, Martin Salcedo, and so there's a lot of legal ramifications or things that are evolving, as with everything goes with the legal environment when things like this occur. So Martin, how would you describe this particular risk in legal context?
Well, thanks, Danny. This is obviously an important issue. The recent shootings in Texas and Ohio have us all thinking about active shooters, and rightfully so. But we can't overlook the fact that mass shootings have become regular occurrences over the past few years. The Gun Violence Archive tracks and compiles mass shooting data nationwide. So far in 2019, 276 people have been killed and 1,054 people have been wounded in 253 mass shooting incidents. The Gun Violence Archive, by the way, defines mass shootings as events in which 4 or more people, excluding the shooter, were shot. They don't have to be killed, but shot at the same general time and location. Since 2013, there's only been one full calendar week without a mass shooting. That was the week of January 5th, 2014.
It's amazing.
Huh? A lot of people don't realize how common these occurrences are. Obviously, the big ones make the news, but there are a number of them. As for the legal context of active shooter-related liability, I think it's fair to describe the law as evolving. Consider this. In 1984, a man walked into a McDonald's in San Ysidro, California, and started shooting indiscriminately. 21 people were killed, 11 others were injured. Survivors sued McDonald's on theories of negligence and premises liability, but a California court concluded that McDonald's was not liable as a matter of law. According to the court, this deranged and motiveless attack, apparently the worst mass killing by a single assailant in recent American history, is so unlikely to occur within the setting of modern life that a reasonably prudent business enterprise would not consider its occurrence in attempting to satisfy its general obligation to protect patrons from reasonably foreseeable criminal conduct. In 1984, the death of 21 people was described as the worst mass killing in recent history. In 2019, it wouldn't be the worst mass killing in the month of August.
Wow.
In 1984, the death of 21 people didn't result in any legal liability to the business establishment. In July of 2019, a jury awarded $3.8 million in damages to a student who was injured during a 2013 school shooting incident. As you can see, the law is evolving, but it tends to move at a slower pace. But more and more lawsuits related to active shooter incidents are being filed, so we can expect this area of the law to develop quite rapidly.
So, so where do you see these incidents happening? Who are the people that are getting sued in these types of incidences?
Well, the short answer on where these are happening is everywhere. I don't think anyone can say with absolute certainty that an active shooter incident would never happen at their business or establishment. In 2014, the FBI released its study of active shooter incidents in the United States between 2000 and 2013. The study identified 11 separate incident location categories in an attempt to identify the primary locations where the public was most at risk. These categories include commercial areas, which are divided into malls, businesses open to pedestrian traffic, and businesses closed to pedestrian traffic, educational environments, which were divided into schools, pre-K through 12th grade, and institutes of higher education, open spaces, government properties, which were divided into military and other governments properties, residences, houses of worship, and healthcare facilities. According to the FBI, 45% of active shooter incidents occurred in areas of commerce. At 24%, educational environments had the second highest incident rate. Open spaces, government properties, and residences rounded out the top 5.
So, who's getting sued in these types of all these actions that happen? It seems like everywhere now. But who are the parties that are getting sued?
Well, similar to my prior answer, lawsuits are being filed against pretty much anyone and everyone who is somehow involved in an active shooter or mass shooting incident in some way or another. Property owners and business owners should certainly expect to be sued. Employers are commonly sued as well. Employers of the active shooter, the perpetrator. The list of potential defendants will vary depending on the circumstances. For example, the owner of the Mandalay Bay Resort in Las Vegas was sued following the country music festival mass shooting. So was the concert promoter. Security companies, law enforcement agencies, employees, contractors, the list of potential defendants goes on and on. About the only thing we can say for sure is that anyone can be sued.
Right. So I guess everyone, I mean, like you said, everybody can be sued, but the parties that are being sued, what's the basis for the legal action?
Well, negligence seems to be the most common basis for trying to hold someone legally liable for an active shooter incident. Negligence typically occurs when someone fails to behave with the level of care that someone of ordinary prudence would have exercised under the same circumstances, the reasonable person standard. There are different kinds of negligence liability claims that can be brought. Premises liability, for example, generally refers to a landowner's or land possessor's duty to exercise ordinary care to keep its premises in a reasonably safe condition so that people who come onto the property don't suffer an injury. The basis of this duty is the owner's superior knowledge of the danger. Negligent security is a type of premises liability. These are claims that are commonly brought. This generally allows an injured person to file a lawsuit based on the duty imposed on landowners and possessors of property to offer reasonable security measures and protect lawful visitors from foreseeable crimes of third parties. Negligent security assumes that the crime could have been prevented or at least made less likely by using appropriate security measures. An active shooter's employer can also be sued for negligent hiring or negligent retention. Negligent hiring generally imposes liability on an employer who hires a person even though the employer knew or had reason to know of that person's particular unfitness, incompetence, or dangerous attributes. A pizzeria, for example, that hires a delivery driver with a dangerous driving history could be liable for negligent hiring if the driver injures somebody while making a delivery. On a similar note, you have negligent retention, which generally imposes liability on an employer who fails to fire an employee even though the employer knew or should have known of that employee's particular unfitness, incompetence, or dangerous attributes. A bar owner, for example, who fails to fire a bouncer that has a history of getting rough with patrons could be liable for negligent retention. But it's important to note that the legal basis for holding someone liable after an active shooter or mass shooting incident is going to depend on the facts. It doesn't have to be negligence. It can be whatever law applies.
All right. So in your opinion, then, what's the tipping point? When does an organization go from being not culpable to being culpable?
I would have to say that the tipping point is foreseeability. Remember that the judge in the 1984 San Isidro case described the shooting of 21 or the killing of 21 as a once-in-a-lifetime massacre. Fast forward 35 years, and that's clearly no longer the case. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the law, into common law negligence, but to prove their case, a plaintiff generally has to establish a legal duty of care, a breach of that duty, and a proximate or legal causal connection between the breach and the injury suffered. The scope or extent of the legal duty that a business might owe often turns on whether the offending conduct and resulting harm were reasonably foreseeable. A legal duty of care is less likely to exist when the conduct or harm isn't foreseeable. A restaurant, for example, doesn't have a legal duty of care to protect diners from falling meteorites. Defendants have successfully argued in the past that active shooters and mass shooting incidents aren't sufficiently foreseeable to create a duty of care. Since a duty of care must exist before it can be breached, victims cannot establish the essential elements of a negligence claim. However, as active shooter and mass shooting incidents increase in frequency, severity, and notoriety, defendants are going to have a harder time disclaiming liability on the grounds that the incident wasn't foreseeable.
Okay, so it's a tough environment to deal with there, but what advice would you give your clients, employers, property owners relative to their need to prepare for an active shooter event?
This one's not too difficult. Active shooters and mass shootings pose a serious risk. Our advice to clients is that they treat them accordingly. Everyone needs to realistically evaluate their risk. Past incidents, for example, tend to suggest that some businesses and establishments may have a higher risk than others. The likelihood of an incident would presumably be higher for churches, synagogues, and mosques than they would be for a small private accounting firm. We also advise all our clients to be on the lookout for incidents or events that may suggest or create a higher risk. For example, an excessively disgruntled employee or customer should be a red flag for any business or organization. And remember that regardless of the risk or how foreseeable you think it might be, some preventative measures are just too basic to overlook. Locking doors, for example, things of that nature, shouldn't be overlooked even if you don't think you'll ever be a victim of an active shooting. Unfortunately, far too many businesses and establishments fail to take even the most basic preventative measures. They believe that active shooters and mass shooting incidents are too random to pose a serious threat. I would argue that the exact opposite is true.
Okay, great. Martin, thank you for all the information and legal research and knowledge. That we appreciate that. Next, I'm gonna move on to Julie Tauenfeld had given us some points that I wanted to reference here in the webinar. Some bullet points and a few more details that I'm going to go over with you here now. These are for handling a crisis PR event. Could be an active shooter, could be used for other type of crisis events too, depending upon your nature of business or other crisis situations that might occur. Be prepared. Have a crisis PR game plan ready to implement before a crisis occurs in your workplace. Be proactive. Don't wait for the media to start calling. Start putting together an initial statement of shock and concern for your employees and their families. Face the crisis. Predetermine who will be the face of your company for both employees and the media with a backup ready. Get out in front of the crisis. Walmart put out a statement with their sympathies fairly quickly after the shooting in El Paso. You would need to do that out front too. The longer you wait, the more confusion you create. Be consistent. Carefully craft an initial message with your PR go-to and stay on it. One message exclusive to employees and their families, plus another for the media. Be sympathetic. Use your words wisely. People are in shock, numb, and terrified. This is your company's image. Don't tarnish it. Provide updates. Families and the media will want to be kept in constant contact. Only provide updates when there's new, very important information to release. Get ready for social media madness. Use the same messaging on your company's Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. Your print and broadcast media. Recognize that outsiders might start playing the blame game, so you might consider shutting down social media completely, as it could be too hard to control. Get ready for prime time. Expect an army of reporters to show up and call. Let them know when you'll be providing updates. If it becomes too much, your go-to PR expert might consider giving exclusives to media that dominate the airwaves and print coverage like CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and the New York Times. Master the media. Don't let the crisis be your first go with reporters. Hire a former journalist with a depth of crisis PR experience to do media training with your executives. you don't want to be a deer in the headlights. So those are all, fantastic points from a planning standpoint for dealing with a PR crisis. Lastly, our last expert is Paul Marshall, and Paul is gonna go over with us some of the insurance and other risk implications for the active shooter and workplace violence insurance coverage. So, like everything that comes up, that we always ask the question first is why did this coverage come about and where did it start?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. In 2016, there were a number of shootings. We had the Aurora Cinema shooting, but there was one shooting up in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm based in Ohio, actually Dayton, Ohio, which we just had a horrific shooting this weekend, part of that. But and there was one little girl shot. She was shot in the back and paralyzed. And the mother asked, school system, can you help my daughter recover, wheelchair, medical bills? And the school system replied saying, well, our insurance carrier says that you need to file a claim, which is unusual for an insured to actually tell a client or an individual, well, you're gonna have to sue us to get the money, basically.
Right.
But that's where the general commercial liability policy, requires most. And so my wife, and I were watching this ensue because we're pretty close, and she kind of nudged me and she said, well, where's the insurance companies? Why aren't they helping? And so at that point I said, we really need a $1, $3, $5, $10 million, med pay, something to help the victim, something to answer the question, who will help the victims? And you see this in the GoFundMe accounts with the mass shootings, whether it be MGM raised 32 million in GoFundMe, Virginia Tech raised 10 million, Parkland, I believe, raised 8 million. You have this act of kindness. After Parkland, the state attorney general offered to pay for funerals, medical care, and counseling. While being taxpayer dollars, it was very clear that the insured's existing policies had no mechanism to reach out. So we like to call it, we're going to put money on the ground, day one, dollar one, that we're helping the victims recover, we're helping the organization recover and the community recover. And if we do that right, we show acts of compassion, act responsibly, we feel there's less likelihood of having the lawsuits later. And that seems to be proving out as we've handled a number of cases. So,
interesting. Workers' compensation for your employees, does that cover these types of workplace violence claims?
Yeah. So you've got work comp. Work comp is a funny little animal, right? In some states, most states, there's a requirement that the employee is actually physically injured. This was created and actually voted into law in Connecticut post Sandy Hook. Many of the first responders who were there described the scene like a Vietnam scene of them going in and trying to help these victims. They then filed work comp claims with the state saying, we can't do our jobs, we need counseling. The state then basically rebutted and said, this is not covered unless you're physically injured, in a way to help, encourage first responders to remain at their post, so to speak. Work comp also, many times if it's unrelated to the job, such as in 30% of these active shooter situations erupt in a domestic violence type scenario. Many times work comp can deny those claims or offer limited coverages. And lastly, sometimes it's a little awkward. We recently had a shooting at a healthcare facility in the parking lot. A nurse at a nursing home was shot while she exited her car to go clock in, and the work comp organization, asked the question, had she clocked in yet? And they did not see her. They did not see a work comp claim. Interesting enough, the GL carrier also responded to the agent's phone call, and basically, because the shooting was rather random, they didn't see any liability. So they basically told the agent, let us know when the family files a lawsuit. Basically we got the phone call at 10:35 a.m. in the morning, and we had people on the ground by 3 p.m. Helping the victims' families, helping the employees with trauma counseling. We had families coming in wanting to bring their parents and grandparents out of the nursing home because someone had put on social media, as we mentioned before, they thought it was a retaliatory attack against the staff. Well, now the staff don't want to be there anymore.
Right.
So as you can imagine, this was an act of randomness, but if you don't get ahead of it and bring in some good, sharp public relations folks, it could, turn pretty dramatic.
Right. Wow. So in addition to workers' comp insurance, you also have business interruption insurance. So how does that respond to these types of situations?
Yeah. So business interruption, we have a number of claim scenarios that we can talk about. Whereas typically business interruption is the coverage is triggered due to a covered property loss if the building is unusable. You find the scenario of Cinemark or the Aurora cinema shooting. That cinema was closed for 6 months, and that's a huge loss of business income. Whereas you have a little closer to home, you have the Tallahassee yoga studio shooting. Unfortunate event where 6 women were randomly shot. That business owner, traumatized, felt she needed to tear out and rebuild the entire inside of the yoga studio, and it was closed for almost a month. Meanwhile, the traditional insurance carriers typically, once the building and property is restored or point of restoration, so they're spackling the bullet holes, fixing the glass, they then call the carrier and say, the building's restored, restaurant restored, and that's when typically the coverage ends, so.
Right, wow. It's an interesting thing to think about for sure. Then we talk about the general liability. How does that typically respond if there's an active shooter or workplace violence expenses or situation?
Yeah, so I touched on it where they require a claim, but we're also finding that it is standard that people have deductibles and retentions. Aurora Cinema and San Bernardino each had a $250,000 per claim deductible on their work comp and their GL.
Wow.
San Bernardino went on record saying they were unable to service the work comp claims due to lack of revenue. The 24 families retained an attorney, and then we had 24 GL claims filing civil suits saying they're not taking care of us. There was also $250,000 per claim deductible on those. So that's when basically San Bernardino said, we're insolvent, we can't even service the defense of this. And you'll find, not that $1 million, 250,000, these deductibles typically are common in the larger organizations, public cities, public school systems. So we just have to be mindful of when an insured or an organization says, hey, we're self-insured, many times they don't realize that they're the ones that we're going to be paying for the PR, the crisis management, the extra social security, social media monitoring, all these extra expenses until these deductibles are met.
Right. So you kind of touched on a little bit of this before with the business interruption, but property coverage, to refurbish or tear down or rebuild or open a business if there's just mental anguish, how do all those things work?
Yeah, so we were contacted by one of our prominent school systems, and they asked us, we want Sandy Hook coverage. And I said, well, that's interesting. What's that? And she says, well, if we need to tear down, rebuild because we can't use the building, which is actually happening very here locally at Parkland. And so Sandy Hook, if we remember, they said the building's unusable. That carrier denied the claim on the grounds that, the property adjuster came out with his little measuring wheel and said, there's just a few bullet holes, right? We'll clean up So they petitioned, and they said, we're going to tear this down. And so that was a cost of about $60 million to the taxpayer dollars. Virginia Tech, another horrific shooting. There was a hall that the shooting occurred. They spent $6 million of their own money just to refurbish. So if you imagine if you're a school system or a place of entertainment, et cetera, you're going to want to change the exits. You're going to want to change it around, and those are typically not covered. Virginia Beach Municipal Building just spent $550,000 in taxpayer dollars to clean up that horrific shooting that just occurred recently.
Wow.
That's a biohazard, keeping in mind, not to get too graphic, but when there's a secure crime scene, nothing leaves. It stays as is, and that includes, unfortunately, the bodies.
Right.
And so we have to be very careful as far as cleaning the place. And back to the yoga studio on the property, she wanted every piece of wood torn out and replaced in order for her to open up. And those things traditional property markets kind of are resistant to.
Yeah, well, I can see there's all kinds of different scenarios and things where this coverage comes into play where people may not have coverage for it, but how expensive is the coverage?
Yeah, so we started in 2016. The coverage is similar to employee practice liability and cyber. Once introduced, the pricing, once we get the pricing fair, it can rapidly reduce. And so, example, back in 2016, we were charging universities and school systems $5 a student. This was a pricing mechanism we had. Well, now that pricing, because the public was resistant to buying it at that price, well, now it's down to 50 cents to $1. And our goal is to bring on 100 policies a month to give us a nice spread of risk. And so we think we've hit that price point. July, we brought on 125 policies throughout the country and all sorts of organizations. And so now our markets are relieved that we have this nice spread of risk and the premiums in order to pay the claims that we're having. So.
Okay, and then so what types of businesses and organizations are buying the coverage?
Yeah, so I don't think there's from rodeos to car dealerships to daycares to synagogues to school systems to accounting firms, everyone's buying it, and many times they're following the headlines. So shopping centers, right now they're viewing the Walmart incident, and now the shopping centers, all these local green vegan type buy local shopping marts are feeling a little bit traumatized and victimized. We had the same thing with the synagogues. When we had the synagogue attacks in California and Philly, we had a number of synagogues come on, but pretty much every industry is buying this. And I think the price point, our minimum premiums have been reduced, and now it's $1,200. So think about the small charter school, small coffee shop, little restaurant, small grocer, small grocery store, probably be a couple $1,000s based on the foot traffic. And so the price point is becoming much more obtainable. And we work with, wonderful agents like yourself that we're getting feedback of, what the budget is within their whole insurance portfolio.
Right. Wow. That's awesome. Well, very good. Our contact information is there up on the screen for myself and our firm. If you have any further questions, if you want to ask some specific questions to your organization or outside of this format, or don't feel comfortable with the specific questions in this particular format, feel free to reach out to us, and we will get right back in touch with you with any information we can provide. Thanks again for everybody, and have a good day.